growing up. We started Ruth last week, just barely got into chapter 1. If you'll recall, this is one of the main purposes of this book, as we pointed out, is to point out that even in the what we often refer to as the dark ages of Israel, not everything was dark. Not everybody was just doing what was right in their own eyes. There were some who were striving to follow God and did follow God faithfully. Ruth and Naomi would be one of those examples. We left off last week right at like I said, at the very beginning of chapter 1. They go into Naomi and her husband. They go to the country of Moab. He takes his wife and his two sons. This man Elimelech. And he takes his wife Naomi and his two sons, Mahlon, Chilion. They go into Moab. Why did they go there? There's a famine in the land in Bethlehem. So they go. Again, we don't know exactly what time period during the Judges this would be. We know it happens during the period that we often refer to as the Judges. But which judge, which time period, we don't know. Some people speculate it's pretty early. Most people speculate it's actually... most people speculate that it was earlier in the period of Judges. Some people just more, some people earlier than others, not more earlier. My English has gone today. But some people speculate maybe during the time of Ehud. Some people, I was trying to remember, not Othniel. Othniel was the first one. I had it in my notes, and but anyway, we covered that last week. I won't worry about trying to dig through my notes to find that. But we just don't. We just know it's during the period of the Judges. So they go. Famine drives them to Moab. The sons end up marrying wives. They end up marrying women who are from Moab. Of course, Orpah is one. Ruth is the other, who will be the subject of a great, pretty much the rest of this book. And Mahlon, Chilion died. Both of them. The woman was left of her two sons and her husband. Of course, Elimelech dies as well. So basically you have Naomi and her two daughters-in-law that are left. And we were talking last week about some of the wild speculation that people get into. Some texts and some books, I don't know, it's just like seems that people go rampant with speculation. And this is one of those. A lot of it is based on the Talmud, the Jewish Talmud. Which, there are some times when the Jewish Talmud is helpful, but, at the end of the day, you have to remember it's uninspired, and there are times when it just, it's been proven that what it's saying, is not verifiable. In fact, the exact opposite is verifiable. So you have to take what the Talmud says with a grain of salt, but the Talmud had said that Mahlon and Chilion were killed for displeasing the Lord. That may be, but what a jump to make when the Bible just says that they died. So, just like with the meaning of the names, we talked a lot about that last week. We can feel pretty confident in the meaning of Naomi's name. It's something to do with pleasant. I was looking for it. I had it written down. There's several meanings: pleasant or helpful. Elimelech is something like God is my king, or my God is king, something like that. And we talked about the El, meaning Jehovah, or Elohim, God, and Melech, meaning king. But beyond that, be careful with the names, because we don't know a whole lot. So the sons die, the father dies, you're left with Naomi and Ruth. And so here you have, they're going to hear that the famine has ended. This is verse 6, and I showed that's where we actually left off last week. They get word that the famine has ended in Bethlehem. I think I mentioned to you that another subject, I don't remember if it was the Talmud or somebody else had speculated or said, it was the Talmud, it's the Jewish Talmud that says an angel of God notified her that the famine had ended in Bethlehem. Well, again, there's nothing here in the text that says that. In those times, God sometimes spoke to people by the mouth of an angel. So it's possible, but to jump to that conclusion and say it with certainty would just be silly. So she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab how that the Lord had visited his people in giving them bread. One more thing before we move on in the text. Hold your spot here and go to 1 Chronicles 4. I'm going to mention this just because you may run across this at some point in studying. One of the things that's different about a study like this from if we were just preaching a sermon from the book of Ruth is that we look at a lot of more in-depth things than what we would if we were just, like I said, if it was just a sermon or a quick overview. And so I want to mention this because you might run across this. It's kind of like with the names. I just don't, I'm not buying it. But Adam Clark mentions this, and as I mentioned last week, he's got some good stuff on the Old Testament. You sort of have to spit out the bones, as we say, when it comes to the New Testament. And sometimes that's the case with the Old Testament because he's human. Any human commentary, that's going to be the case. But 1 Chronicles 4, and make sure that's the, yes. Notice what it says, verse 22. 1 Chronicles 4:22 says, "And Joachim and the men of Kozeba and Joash and Seraph, who had the dominion in Moab, and Jashub Ilahim, and these are ancient things." Now, let me get my electronic Bible out because different versions translate that just a slight bit different. I think the ESV was the one I wanted. 1 Chronicles 4:22. Adam Clark believes these men mentioned here are the same as Mahlon and Chilion. Joachim, the men of Kozeba, and Joash and Seraph, who ruled in Moab and returned to Lehem. And this, I'm reading now from the ESV. And then a parenthetical note, now the records are ancient. So you can see a little bit different translation from the King James. But it says they returned to Lehem or Lehem. I'm not ruling it out. It's possible that these are the same and they had some kind of dominion or rule in Moab. But it says they returned. Well, the two men mentioned here in our text, they died there in Moab. So I don't know. I wanted to mention that because sometimes commentators bring that up, and you may run across that and wonder, okay, well, is that the same guys? Again, it's possible. I just, at my point in study, I don't think it likely. But be that as it may, back to Ruth chapter 1. I did want to mention that because sometimes that comes up. And Adam Clark he wasn't dogmatic about it, but it sounded to me like reading his notes that he felt like those were the same men as Mahlon and Chilion. But I just don't see that personally. So back to verse 6. She's going to rise with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, because she heard in the country of Moab how that the Lord had visited his people in giving them bread. So she goes forth out of the place where she was, her two daughters-in-law with her. They went on the way to return to the land of Judah. Well, pretty self-explanatory up to this point. The famine's over. They've heard about it. They're going back. Naomi says to her two daughters-in-law, "Go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me." Well, she says, they had treated her right. They'd been good to her. She's sending them away with a blessing. And she's going to explain this further in verse 9 beginning. "The Lord grant you that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voice and wept. So they say to her, "Surely we will return with thee unto thy people." Well, you get close as a family, even in-laws here. And so they said, "Look, we'll just go back with you." And so now she's really going to give them a more in-depth explanation. So she says in verse 11, "Turn again, my daughters, Why will you go with me? Are there yet any more sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? And she's saying, I'm too old to have any more children. I'm certainly not with child now. Then she says, turn again, my daughters, go your way, for I'm too old to have an husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband also tonight, and should also bear sons, would you tarry for them till they were grown? Would you stay for them from having husbands? In other words, you're going to wait, several years for them to get old enough to marry you? Nay, my daughters, for it grieveth me much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord is gone out against me. This is a phrase you'll see a lot in Hebrew literature or something similar. The hand of the Lord has gone out against me. I think it is worth mentioning before we move on that they use this phrase a lot differently than people would use it now. Sometimes people today will say, God's hand is heavy upon me, or why is God doing this to me? In the sense of God, it's almost in the sense of, and not everybody I understand, but a lot of times in the sense as if God has singled me out and He's punishing me. He's doing this to me. So, but the Hebrews didn't use it this way. They're just, they would say things almost as if God is in control of everything, but not in the sense of God really did this to me. God is, the old, you've probably heard the illustration before, like from Greek mythology, Zeus, throwing lightning bolts at somebody. That's how sometimes people use that today. They didn't. It's just the idea as if here something has happened. Many times, and you see this a lot in Hebrew literature, something that God has allowed to happen. He may not intervene miraculously and stop it. It's something that God has permitted to happen. Sometimes it's through human free will. Sometimes it's through weather. But something that God has permitted to happen, and they'll attribute it to God. A good example is the Bible will say there are two parallel accounts. One of them is in 2 Samuel. The other one I want to say is in 1 Chronicles, where David numbers the people like a census. One passage says David provoked, the devil. I've had a long couple of days. I did not sleep well on the men's retreat, and I didn't sleep well the night before, and now I'm all stuffed up, and I hope I'm not trying to get sick. I hope it's just allergies. So y'all bear with me if I'm foggy this morning. The devil, it says in one of those passages, incited David to number the people. The other passage says God moved David to number the people. And so sometimes skeptics and atheists and so on, they'll latch onto that and they'll say, well, which is it? You got a contradiction here. Either David did it, either God moved him to do that, or the devil did. So, how can it be both ways? Well, the fact is, the devil, the same way he will move us or incite us to do things that are wrong today, he can't make us do anything, but he'll use various means to try to trick people, to try to deceive them, to try to motivate them into sin. But what he's talking about, and when it says God, idiom is the right word, maybe more better, might be more appropriate to say an expression. It's an expression in Hebrew literature. The hand of the Lord has gone out against me because God has allowed this. Yes. Yes. And sometimes, and I've taught Job or talked about the book of Job, and especially Job chapter 1, where Job will actually say, the Lord's given and the Lord's taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And I've criticized Job on that before, and it's a pretty strong statement from Job, and I still am kind of up in the air, but reading this and studying this with the book of Ruth and thinking about this and how in Hebrew literature they so often would say, oh, the hand of the Lord's gone out against me. God's given, God's taken away. I'm a little bit more careful now. Maybe Job missed it and was attributing too much of that to God, but maybe he was just using this expression like we see here with Ruth, or Naomi, sorry, I keep saying Ruth. But just to understand that not every single time in Hebrew literature where they say something like this? Are they trying to say, wow, God did this to me? God is giving me these bad circumstances. So I just, take that under consideration in any context. But yeah, in Job, and of course, sometimes in Job, you see where his friends just completely miss it, and they tell Job, this is happening to you because you're sinning. And they are attributing it to God in the same way that people do today, because they're saying to Job, essentially, you need to repent, whatever you've done, so that God will stop punishing you so heavily. And Job will reply to them, he never claims sinless perfection, but he says, I haven't done anything that God's punishing me for. And they'll just return right back and say, oh, yeah, yes, you have. God doesn't punish anybody that, bad things don't happen to good people, is essentially what they're saying. And the whole book is showing us that sometimes bad things do happen to good people. So anyway, I wanted to mention that before we move on, because people use that concept very differently today than what you see many times in Old Testament literature. So they lifted up their voice, and they wept again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So Orpah, at this point, she decides to, or Naomi, if I keep saying Ruth, y'all just have to know which one I'm talking about here. I'm going to try to get these straight. It confuses me sometimes because you're in the book of Ruth and you're talking about Naomi. Orpah listens to Naomi. At first she was going to stay with her. Naomi says, I don't have any more sons. Even if I had a husband right now, would you wait? Would you wait for a child to be born? Would you wait for him to grow and be marriageable age? Obviously it's a silly question. No, that's not going to happen. So you need to go home and you need to live your life, is basically what Naomi tells them. It's a logical statement, right? It's a logical request, order, however you want to view it. It makes sense. So Orpah says, okay. But Ruth, still kind of stubbornly saying, no. Naomi said, behold, thy sister-in-law is gone. This is verse 15. Is gone back unto her people and unto her gods. Return thou after thy sister-in-law. Ruth said, you know the verse 16, entreat me not to leave thee or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go. Where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, thy God, my God. Where thou diest, will I die. There will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me. So she basically says, no, I'm staying with you regardless. She has formed a bond. I don't know at this point how much does she understand Naomi following Jehovah versus going back to Moab and the false gods of Moab. Maybe she does. Maybe she's learned that from her association with Naomi and the family. Maybe it's just her great love for Naomi. Maybe it's a little bit of both. That might be the most logical answer. But for whatever reason, she says to Naomi, even though Orpah has said, okay, yeah, you make a good point, I'm going to go back home. Ruth says, I'm not. I'm with you. And I'm going wherever you move to, I'm coming with you. Wherever you live, I'm going to live there. The God you follow, the God you serve, I'm going to serve him. And wherever you end up dying, that's where I'm going to be. And so it's this great, I've sometimes said it's kind of interesting that this is used in a lot of wedding ceremonies, even though it's between a mother-in-law and her daughter-in-law, not necessarily between a husband and wife here, but it's the point, the commitment, the great bond that they have. And she says, I'm going to go wherever you go, because she feels like, even though it's by marriage, even though it's by law, however we want to view that, she says, you're my family now, Naomi, and I'm staying with you. And so that's the concept that is being iterated over and over again in marriage ceremonies. When you hear this, is the idea of sticking together. So Ruth tells Naomi, I'm still going with you. Notice verse 18, when Naomi saw that Ruth was steadfastly minded to go with her, then she left speaking unto her. Does anybody have anything different? I don't know if anybody's got a New King James or an ESV. Anybody have anything different there in verse 18? This is a Hebrew idiom. I was going to look at the ESV and see if it had anything different. But it's a very interesting, ESV just has determined. Steadfastly minded I like a little bit better, but it's let me find the literal translation. Verse 18. The literal translation is, she made herself strong. In other words, Naomi sees Ruth has made herself strong, so she left off speaking unto her. And it's a Hebrew idiom that means, we sometimes use the expression strong-willed, right? Stubborn. She saw that Naomi had made her will strong. In other words, she's not going to change her mind on this. So it's interesting. We've talked about this, not to get into a whole lesson about translation. You have to be careful when you're talking Bible translations. You want a translation that's accurate, but sometimes, and I've been guilty of this myself, we say, I want a translation that is literal, word for word. And the bottom line is, no, we don't. Because there are sometimes things that we just wouldn't understand. There are times when you have to at least offer some kind of an explanation. There was another one, I was trying to think of it, and it's just slipped my mind, but there's another Hebrew idiom that it refers to a portion of a person's face, and I was trying to remember, it might be the forehead, but it's referred to like a strong will. Well, if you translate that literally word for word, and you don't know anything about that Hebrew expression or that idiom, it makes no sense. Now, with verse 18, if you translate that literally, when she saw that she made herself strong, she left speaking unto her. You could probably figure that out, but it makes better sense, a little bit better translated for us who are not Jewish, who are not Hebrew in that culture. It makes a little more sense to say, well, when she saw that she was determined or steadfastly minded. But an interesting Hebrew idiom there. When she saw she made herself strong. By the way, what is an idiom? We sometimes use that expression. What does that mean? Idioms are so much fun when you go to a place where they speak a different language. They're so much fun for the one who knows the idiom. But every culture and every language has them. What is the definition? Does anybody know this? It's something that makes no sense literally. For example, that's exactly the one that came to my mind. We sometimes say, man, it is raining cats and dogs out there. I said that one time, I think it was my first trip to Nicaragua. The one day when, you may remember the pictures, I showed the river that was the little dirt road, and it was no longer a road when this deluge happened. It was a little small river. But I said something about, man, it is raining cats and dogs, and a couple of the translators looked at me and they were like, do what? And I had to explain this is an American idiom. I was trying to think of another one. Who can think of another one? Yeah, where's the world? Feelings on his sleeve, something like that. Is that if you take it literally, it's like, what? That makes no sense. We just use them like second nature. And it's hilarious to go to a place where, even though you may have people that speak English, it's not their first language. And we went somewhere to eat. I think he'd gone home with me that weekend, and we finished, and we kind of pushed back from the table at this buffet or whatever, and I said, whoo, man, I'm about as full as a tick on a red-bone hound. And he looked at me, and he said, what? So I explained it to him, and then it was even funnier a few months later when we were somewhere else and sitting around with some people, and he starts patting his belly, and he says, I am full as tick on red bone. But, idioms, they don't make sense translated literally, but there's a meaning there. And so when Naomi saw that Ruth was making herself strong, she was determined. Then she left speaking to her. So they go, verse 19, until they came to Bethlehem. So they started in Bethlehem, remember. They left because of the famine. They go to Moab. the two boys marry, the two boys die, the husband dies, and now Naomi has come back. Orpah has returned home, so it's Naomi and Ruth. She goes back to Bethlehem. Came to pass when they were come to Bethlehem that all the city was moved about them, and they said, "Is this Naomi?" Well, they didn't have internet, they didn't even have newspaper, but word travels fast, doesn't it? And especially Bethlehem being a small town, it always was a small town. In fact, later on, there's going to be a prophecy. Thou Bethlehem Ephratah, though thou be little among the nations, yet shall he come forth from me that shall be ruler. Of course, prophecy of Jesus. But word travels fast in a small town. And so they say, "Oh, is this Naomi? Naomi's come back." And she said unto them, verse 20, "Call me not Naomi, call me Marah, for the Almighty hath dealt very bitterly with me." You may have a note in your Bible, Marah or Mara means bitter. You recall when Israel came out of Egypt, they came to a place and the water there was very bitter. And Moses, I believe it was hyssop that the Lord told him to put in there to sweeten the waters, to make them drinkable, in other words. So there's this brackish water, and God heals it. And they called the name of the place Marah. It means bitter. So she says, "Don't call me pleasant." That was what Naomi means, or something akin to pleasant. "Call me bitter, because God has dealt very, very bitterly with me." At this point, again, you see that expression. And again, I don't try to pretend. She may have more of this concept of God is doing this to me than we realize. But it seems that it's the Hebrew expression of something God has allowed to happen, and they attribute it to God sometimes. But I think, I read the book of Ruth in this passage, and I think, it's sometimes you read that and you think, "Boy, she's kind of whether if she is indeed attributing more of it to God, you think she's saying, man, God's really dealt bitterly with me." But I can't understand, but I can imagine some of just a little bit of how she must feel. She fled the famine to another country with her husband. They have their two sons. They make a home there. And then the sons find wives, and obviously they got along very well with their daughters-in-law. Life seems like it's, getting better for them in spite of this horrible famine that had hit Bethlehem and their homeland. Okay, well, we've settled here. Maybe things are starting to turn up. And then the husband dies. And then the sons die. And so I think probably most of us would feel this way. Wow, this is a pretty bitter pill to swallow. She says in verse 21, "I went out full, the Lord hath brought me home again empty. Why then call ye me Naomi, pleasant, seeing the Lord hath testified against me, and the Almighty hath afflicted me?" This is where I tend to think she's gone a little bit past just the expression, and she's having a hard time dealing with this. I don't know if she's full on blaming God for this, but she certainly seems very, very close to it, if not. But also remember that who's speaking here? Who's saying these words there in 20 and 21? It's Naomi, right? This is not, sometimes things are recorded in the Bible. For example, we mentioned Job a while ago, the statement in Job, "The Lord's given and the Lord's taken away." Job didn't realize God had not taken away. So sometimes statements are recorded that are, the writing down of the statement is inspired, but the statement itself is not inspired. And you want a perfect example? Go back to the book of Job. Mrs. Job, what did she say to him? Curse God and die. Now, is that an inspired statement? Obviously not. I mean, to ask that question is to answer it, right? The writing down of it within the book of Job, the recording of it, was inspired. But her words, as she spoke them to her husband, "Curse God and die," no, that's not inspired, obviously. So Naomi she's struggling to deal with all this and wrap her mind around all this. But she returns, verse 22, with Ruth, of course, with her, the Moabitess. They returned out of the country of Moab. They came to Bethlehem in the beginning of barley harvest. So They're coming back to Bethlehem, and it is the beginning of barley harvest. Orpah rather, has gone back, and Ruth has clung to Naomi. And I have a note from one somebody I got from their class notes, and I don't know that we can blame Orpah for going back, but the lesson here, obviously the focus is on Ruth because she stayed with her mother-in-law. But what I was just going to make a point from that is, I don't have to do what everybody else does, right? I don't have to follow somebody else just because that may make sense or that may seem like the logical thing to do. Some of the most amazing acts of faith throughout Scripture didn't really make sense on the surface of it, right? But Ruth stays with Naomi, and you know, the Bible will follow her story. And what do we know about Orpah from this point on? Nothing, right? And hopefully Orpah went and lived faithfully to God. We don't know. She may have gone back into idolatry with the people of Moab, or she may have learned from Naomi and been faithful. But the Bible text sticks with Ruth, and we learn a lot about her. And of course, she ends up in the lineage of Christ. I want to turn to a passage in Leviticus. Hold your spot there in Ruth and look at the book of Leviticus, chapter 19. Sometimes we read Leviticus, there's a lot of detailed laws and things like that, and sometimes it can be difficult reading, and sometimes we feel like, well, what is the point? Well, there's some background for the book of Ruth in Leviticus 19. Look at verse 9. God, through Moses, commands the people. He says, when you reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not wholly reap the corners of thy field, neither shalt thou gather the gleanings of thy harvest. Thou shalt not glean thy vineyard, neither shalt thou gather every grape of thy vineyard. Thou shalt leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God. And so he's giving some, I think there's another parallel passage if we want to look at it. For time's sake, we're not going to, but there's a parallel also in Deuteronomy. So when he repeats the law to the new generation before they go into the land, he's saying, when you go through your fields and you're reaping the harvest, don't go back over it. You know, sometimes you ever do that when you're picking your garden? You pick whatever it is you're gathering out of the garden, and then you go over it again. Why? Because you always miss something, right? In fact, one of my favorite things is fresh cucumbers out of the garden. And I used to plant cucumbers all the time, and if you miss a cucumber, and you will inevitably, because they blend in so well, but you miss a cucumber and you come back 2 or 3 days later, and all of a sudden there's this big yellow, like almost a small watermelon, and it's no good anymore. But we'll go and go again, sometimes 2 or 3 times to try to make sure. He says, no, when you reap your fields once, you go over it once. Don't go over it again. He's making provision for the poor, for the stranger, the fatherless, the poor, the downtrodden, the widows. God made provision for them right within the law of Moses. So he says, you don't go out and try to go over it with a fine-tooth comb to make sure you got every little bit you could get. And that's the background for what you're going to see, chapter 2. She's going to go out. It's the beginning of barley harvest. So Naomi has a kinsman, chapter 2, verse 1 tells us. Kinsman of her husband's a mighty man of wealth of the family of Elimelech. His name was Boaz. Ruth says to Naomi, let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn after him in whose sight I shall find grace. And she said unto her, go, my daughter. And she went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And her hap was to light upon a part of the field belonging unto Boaz, who was of the kindred of Elimelech. Well, the King James here says her hap was to light on a part of the field belonging unto Boaz. Her chance, in other words, right? I was looking to see what the ESV had there. That was verse 3. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. In other words, she didn't know. She doesn't see this field. She hasn't scoped this out and said, okay, he's a relative. He's good looking. I'm going to go reap in his field. Nothing like that. This is just chance. And yet it's not altogether chance either. We might say it's providence. There's nothing miraculous going on here, but it is providential. And so she goes to begin reaping, and she ends up in the field of a man named Boaz. And as it turns out, Boaz is a relative. And so Boaz comes from Bethlehem. He says to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." They answered him, "The Lord bless thee." This is a common greeting between them. Boaz, then said Boaz unto his servant that was set over the reapers, "Whose damsel is this?" Well, he sees Ruth. She obviously was pretty. She caught his eye. He says, "Hey, who's this lady?" Most of us men, we've been there, right? Maybe the first time you met your wife, or at some point or another, you said to somebody, "Hey, who is that?" She caught his eye. And the servant that was set over the reapers answered and said, "It is the Moabitess damsel that came back with Naomi out of the country of Moab." Well, that's the Moabite lady. Again, small town. They've already heard about them. They've heard about Naomi and Ruth coming back. They've heard about Ruth coming back with Naomi. But it's that Moabitess damsel that came back with Naomi. And she said, this is the reaper speaking to Boaz, what he's quoting what Ruth said to him, "I pray you, let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves." So she came and hath continued even from the morning until now, that she tarried a little in the house. In other words, he's saying she's from morning till now, she's been reaping, except for the one break she took in the house. So she took a short break, but she's been gathering. Another lesson I think you see in this is the work ethic of Ruth, right? She tells Naomi, "I'm going to go out." This is her mother-in-law. This is not her blood relative. But she said in the beginning, when they were coming back, when Naomi tried to get them to go home, she said, "I'm going with you. And I'm going, wherever you lodge, I'll lodge. Wherever you die, I'll die. Your God will be my God. Your people, my people. I'm coming with you." And now she's making good on her. She's making good on her promise. And she's going to go out, and she says, "I'm going to take care of you. I'll go out and I'll reap, and I'll bring home some food to take care of us." So the reaper is telling Boaz about how she came, and she asked permission to follow the reapers. And that's kind of how this would work during the harvest. Again, a good Jewish man would not have his reapers going over and over and over the field. They go through, and then here's someone who's poor or destitute. They could just follow behind them, and whatever got missed, they could pick it up. The corner of the field, they could reap that, and so on. So Boaz says to Ruth, "Hearest thou not, my daughter?" This is verse 8. Go not to glean in another field, neither go from hence, but abide here fast by my maidens." Well, as you can imagine, as they're reaping and they're just leaving the leftovers, you're always going to miss some, but going to be relatively small in comparison, right? Is that the second bell? It's going to be relatively small in comparison and just get in the corner. So you're probably going to have to go to more than one field, right? So we'll stop here. Boaz is going to tell her, "Listen, you don't worry about it. You don't have to go to another field. I'm going to make sure you have everything you need in this field." He's a sly fella. He's going to make sure this pretty lady that's caught his eyes stays close by, because he's interested in her, and he wants to keep her close. But he's also a good man in that he wants to help her out. And so he's going to basically tell her, "Don't go to another field. I'll make sure you have more than enough here." So I'm going to make a note. What was that, verse 8? Yes. We'll pick up with verse 9, Lord willing, next week. This is when the story gets really good, because just the work ethic of Ruth and her humility, but also the benevolence and care that Boaz shows toward her is just my favorite part of this whole book. Thank you very much. We'll pick up verse 9, Lord willing, next week.